Hi everyone, welcome to the Climate Confident Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Laird. Laird, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Tom. Sure. I am the graduate director for two graduate programs at Prescott College in the United States, a Master of Science in Resilient and Sustainable Communities and a Master of Science in Environmental Studies.
Okay, superb. And Laird, how did you get into sustainability day one? Because it's not a science that has been around for a particularly long time. I remember when I was in university, the closest we had to anything like it was ecology. And I'm guessing it's an out branch from that or a branch of that now, maybe not. Tell me, how did you get into it and what's your background?
Yeah, well, that was certainly the case for me. I started off as an environmental activist way back in the day, working in defense of ancient forests out in the Pacific Northwest, which is my home bioregion. And for most of my career, I was focused primarily on the preservation of wild spaces. And it was only when the impacts of global climate change on those forests that I loved so much, and I would try to get out as far as I could, away from any human influence that I could. Mm-hmm. But before long, I was starting to see the impacts on those forests and recognizing that the best way to begin to defend those forests in this time is to begin to work with people in cities and reconsider the way that people go about their business as usual and hopefully begin to limit the impacts of carbon emissions on the climate. So I come from that place of a real sense of belonging, or at least a sense of safety that I've always felt in wild spaces. And I recognize that that is a privilege. And we can talk about that more later if you would like to. But I feel like I'm still doing the same work. I've just had to go about it in different ways and train people, provide the skills and knowledge that they need to help transform human societies one community at a time.
Okay, and what kind of impacts were you seeing happen on the old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of impact with die-offs of different species, either because of drought or because of diseases that are able to spread more easily. And we see this throughout North America as well, that the natural spread of some blights and other diseases is accelerated by the weakening of ecosystems due to climate change, due to drought. So you can travel through northeastern Oregon, southeastern Washington, and see just massive areas, ridge after ridge of trees that have turned reddish brown as they're either close to death or dying. And it has impacts on so many species within those forests as well. So it's still, for me, it started as a form of forest defense, but over the years, working with really inspirational students who are addressing different aspects of the current climate crisis in their communities, I've really become excited about other aspects of that job. But that is where it started for me.
Okay. And tell me a little bit about how you can work to mitigate the damage of climate change.
Yeah, well, it is, as I mentioned, a global problem, and it requires global solutions, and those global solutions tend to be determined at the international level through for example, the COP meetings, the representatives of different governments, as well as increasingly the representation of large corporations, and more promising, the representation of people who have suffered loss and damages from climate change. So there's that sphere of activity, which is absolutely essential to reaching agreements on how we can begin to lessen the effects of climate change. But as I think we all know, that process is inescapably tangled up in larger political and economic factors that really leave us somewhat disempowered. If we saw that as the only way forward, we would be spending all of our time figuring out how do we try to convince this representative from that nation to agree to this fund for loss and damages and that sort of thing. And I'm so glad that we have people doing that work. I'm also so glad that it's not me. And so instead, I get to work with students primarily in their own communities because there are local and regional manifestations of climate change. And some of the ways that we can look at local and regional responses suggest changes in policy. Some of them suggest changes in lifestyle. Some of them require really fundamental transformations in the way that we see ourselves as humans living in human cultures. And those kinds of solutions, adaptation solutions, can be very long-term. So at the same time that I'm trying to help students identify ways in the short term of reducing carbon emissions, we're also thinking about what's going to happen for us to become the kinds of communities that, for example, are willing to open our doors to other people who have been displaced by the impacts of our emissions here in North America or in Europe or other places as well. And that really requires, as I said, a fundamental transformation of how we see ourselves in relation to other people. And what would it mean to create a culture that is more welcoming and able to help heal the damage that we've caused? That's a huge project. It won't take place in my generation, but if we can take small steps toward it, and every time I get a new batch of students in, and then they go out into the world after earning their degree, picking up these skills and knowledge, they're hopefully influencing other people as well. As a former community organizer, as well as an environmental activist, I have to believe that that's where much of the change actually occurs, is in the face-to-face interactions that people have with other members of their communities.
Fascinating, because I come from I studied biology in university, but I come from a tech background professionally. And, for me, I'm used to changing a line of code here and seeing an instant response in the output. And you're talking about changes that'll take decades before they start to really show any results. I've said it many times, changing technology is easy, changing people is much, much, much harder. And you're talking about people being welcoming to migrants, for example, which is quite a hot political topic at the moment because the tide seems to be going in the opposite direction. How do we make that change so that people do become more welcoming? Because the numbers are massive. We saw with the Syrian civil war, something like 5 million Syrian refugees enter Europe. And the ripples of that are still being felt, over 10 years later. And that's 5 million. We're talking about a lot of countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in even parts of Latin and Central America becoming unlivable, and literally hundreds of millions of refugees coming to countries where the climate is more livable. How do we deal with those kind of numbers, and how do we change people to become, in your terms, more welcoming?
I appreciate that question. There are a couple of things I'd like to touch on in answering it, and I'll begin with the technology piece of that, because there's no doubt in my mind that we need the advances in technology that help provide alternatives to fossil fuel produced energy. And this is forcing all kinds of uncomfortable negotiations between folks like me who've been in the environmental movement for a long time, where we have to, for example, consider that nuclear energy, which was just a no-brainer 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that because of the waste, that's not something we should be producing. And now we have to acknowledge the fact that it is an alternative that produces less carbon or potentially even no carbon. So it's been really interesting to watch my fellow activists go through the contortions that allow us to say, okay, we need some big tech solutions. And also that to have these big tech solutions, we need the funding to do that, which means that some solutions are going to emerge out of an economic model that probably at least half of my students would say, this is a dysfunctional model. This economic model is, in fact, at the root of the problems that we're facing now. So we need to revise our economy, our economic practices and visions and priorities in addition to that. These are two problems that seem to be at odds with each other. And some of my students find themselves strongly on the Extinction Rebellion side, that we need to dismantle these processes right now, while other students of mine are going to work for government agencies and for corporations and looking into technological solutions. And sometimes they bang heads. But I do want to suggest that I think both of these well-intentioned actions are necessary, and that when we see people trying to drive a wedge between people who express their concern and take action in different ways, that's not doing us any good. And Michael Mann, who's been in the news a lot recently in his book, The New Climate Wars, looks deeply into the industrial forces that are behind driving those wedges between different elements of the climate justice community. So I would start by saying that, yes, there's an obvious disconnect between these two ways of approaching the problem. But if we dwell on the differences, we're losing momentum. Now, in terms of how we potentially can become the kinds of people who can be welcoming to other people who've been displaced by our own activities, it requires an evolution of values, of course, but even more so in this particular day and age, it requires a different approach to communication. We are so polarized, certainly in the U.S., but I see it in Europe as well, and I imagine it's happening in other parts of the world, where we're not able to find common ground anymore, and frequently that very idea of common ground is equivalent to political failure. And that's too bad. You know, the old model, the democratic model where sides would come together and make compromises to find common ground, now it seems almost historic. Yeah, we used to do things that way, and that was the engine by which the clumsy mechanism of democracy moved forward in incremental paces. But now we find ourselves not willing to make those compromises. So when I've done this work with students myself, and I taught a course called Communicating Across Differences around the resettlement of Syrian refugees in a city in Vermont, we started with the practice of nonviolent communication. And this is a part of my background as a community organizer along with consensus facilitation. But nonviolent communication recognizes that a lot of the patterns through which we communicate with one another are in fact antithetical to A, really hearing the other person, B, being able to find empathy for that person. I can continue to tick these off, but to be able to echo back to them what they've said so they know they're being heard, and then to express or to ask questions that may lead toward another possible way of seeing things. It's a long, complicated, and very vulnerable process that people who are motivated by one-upsmanship, by the need to win an argument, they're going to continue to manifest those harmful, communication patterns. But it begins by listening and acknowledging. And so in the case right now, we've got a somewhat manufactured political crisis around immigration on our southern border. And it's easy for people on the various sides of the issues just to point fingers and say, this is ridiculous. Why are they worried about that? Or whatever it may be. And instead, what we need to be doing is training people to listen and to ask the questions and gain trust by doing so. What are your concerns? How are you feeling about this? How does it feel to you compared to the way it felt living in this place where you were younger? So that whole first stage is really listening, helping them feel heard and helping them understood. And that clears the table for potentially asking those questions that take us into other possibilities. When I was doing this work back in Vermont with the Syrian refugees, my students and I met with a leader of the group that had organized against allowing Syrian refugees to settle in that city. And at the end of our listening session with him, he was in tears. And he said, I've not felt like anyone has heard me. And I feel so often demonized by my neighbors that it's been really painful. And we never really needed to even move past that point with this gentleman, because what we were doing was we were creating a website where we tried to represent as accurately as possible the different perspectives of people around this issue. And his honest feelings, his honest fears, that's all we really needed from him. But in feeling heard, he was transformed, and we were transformed. It became impossible then for us to see him in a two-dimensional way anymore, this man who had shed tears with us after this conversation. That's not the whole solution. That's just where it starts. But it suggests how something can happen at the personal level or at the community level that begins to move us towards a possibility of becoming a more welcoming culture. Sure.
But something like that, how do you measure success of a program like that, and how well does it scale? Which is an even bigger issue given, the number of immigrants, refugees, whatever, that's going to scale.
It's a really good question. And I think the scale is a part of the problem. And I think that the media is a part of the problem. And by that, I don't necessarily mean the corporate medium as much as I'm thinking about social media as well. And one of the problems, and I see this, I just this past week, I was leading a discussion with my students about ways that they were comfortable engaging with their communities. And the most common response was through social media. And that led to a conversation about the ways in which social media creates, yes, an opportunity for communication, but not the kind of communication that involves being sensitive to the responses of people who may question you or may disagree with you. It's very different to post your feelings online than it is to actually go to a community meeting, for example, about a contentious topic, and to really listen and to be able to show other people that you've heard them, to be able to express your own views, not out of a sense of demonstrating why you're right or why you're morally superior, but this is how it looks to me. There's actually something almost postmodern about that position of being able to see a contentious issue from multiple points of view. To admit, for example, I don't know what this might look like to you if you've had this experience, but based on my experience, it looks like this. So I suppose that's a level of scaling up, right? From individual conversations to going to community meetings. But how that begins to manifest itself at the national level, at the international level, there are so many other factors in this system that mitigate against open, honest, vulnerable communication that I'm not quite sure what that looks like. And so what we see, as we did at the most recent COP meeting, when we finally were able to see a little progress towards loss and damages for people whose homes have been devastated by the impacts of climate change. We've created a budget now. It's a tiny step forward. And largely that was based, I think, on a response to a civil, I wouldn't call it civil disobedience, but activism, in-your-face activism, both at COP, but also around the world, in capitals and cities and other places, people saying, look, we have to accept responsibility for what we've done in creating these impacts that have harmed or displaced these people. It's small steps. And that's one of the problems, Tom, is that the pace of damage being caused by climate change is completely different than the pace of the solutions. And in leaning on my friendship with climate scientists and policy folks, I have accepted the idea that the most urgent thing that we could be doing right now is keep it in the ground. We have to do whatever we can to lower our carbon emissions and eventually get to zero carbon emissions. That's the urgent work. Everything else takes place at a different pace. So right now, for example, I'm here in Southwest Virginia in the United States, where there is a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline that's running from the hills of West Virginia on down to North Carolina, right through the national forest where I work as a trail steward right now. And there's strong civil disobedience, strong resistance to that, people being thrown in jail every day, it seems like, some people in jail without bail still. Those are such heroes to me, the water protectors, the pipeline protesters. And one thing I learned years ago while working in forest activism was that for agencies to begin to change the way that they do things, the politicians have to create different expectations for them. And the politicians respond to public displays of outrage or pressure or lack of campaign funding or whatever it may be. So it's this convoluted loop that's really unfortunate. And there are all of these opportunities for misbehavior in that loop. But it starts with the outrage, impacts the political system, impacts the policies, and then we can get to a place where, for example, clear cutting of old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest pretty much came to an end, at least on public lands. But that took years, and we don't have years now. And in fact, I was just looking at some reports this morning. We just had the hottest February on record, over 1.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which gets us past the 1.5 that we've been using as a benchmark that we need to stay under. And it seems to me, I'm sorry to say it, that because we're not able to put on the brakes quickly enough in terms of carbon emissions, and we are beginning to move past these benchmarks, we will continue to see increasingly damaging impacts of climate change, which I suppose the best case scenario is that experiencing those impacts will lead people to demand political accountability, political change, but not at the pace that we need. So more than ever, I'll just make a quick transition here. I've had students dealing with the impacts of climate anxiety, especially over the last few years, and it seemed to emerge around the same time as the pandemic and the kinds of fears and vulnerability people felt during that period. And out of that, we also see this sustained feeling of despair and helplessness around a problem that is so vast that the magnitude of the problem suggests that there's nothing you could do about this as an individual. Sure, you could ride your bike instead of driving your car, that sort of thing, but it's not going to make much difference. Well, in working with students and trying to help them become more emotionally resilient as they do this work, I turned to an old mentor, Joanna Macy, whose work with Chris Johnstone has been published in a book and an online training called Active Hope. And they make the point early on that hope is a practice in, say, the Buddhist sense of the word. It's not something that you just have. I'm a hopeful person. It's something that you cultivate over a period of time. And I began to offer these sessions with my students through colloquia and teach-ins and that sort of thing, where we moved through the active hope steps. And step one is acknowledging things that you're grateful for, because that puts us in a position of resilience when we recognize, oh, there are some good things in my life, and I want to give thanks for those. The next step, which is always very jarring, is honoring our pain for the world. It sounds counterintuitive to honor the pain, but when we recognize that the pain that we feel, the grief, the anxiety, the anger, is basically a signal, a negative feedback loop from the system that is alerting us that we need to change our course. It's the warning bell on the Titanic, heading for the iceberg. that we recognize, okay, this feels horrible, but it serves an absolutely essential function, and I want to honor that function. That's a transitional step for a lot of people. The third and the fourth step are really about how do we move forward. Seeing with new eyes is the third step, where we begin to look around us and find examples of other people doing the work that needs to be done. We take inspiration from them. We begin to see ourselves as part of what Paul Hawkins calls the largest social movement in the history of humanity. And then the fourth step is to take action. And those actions can take place at very small steps that may not seem like they're likely to have an impact on global carbon emissions, for example, but we are empowered when we take action. And that empowerment, along with the rest of this process, allows us to keep from being so discouraged that we just disengage. So the most important thing that we can do as climate activists or people who are just concerned about climate is to go through those steps, to recognize that we're not alone. And even if we're taking small steps that are easy for other people to diminish, to say, oh, that's not going to do any good, to know that, well, yes, it's doing good because it's keeping me going to these meetings or sending these letters to my representatives or whatever it may be. Small scale change, slow change, slower than we need, but it needs to be happening as the other more immediate types of action are also happening.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've published 160-something episodes of this podcast, and several times the topic of climate anxiety, for example, has come up. And I think you're the first, if I'm right, person to talk about how to self-care in that kind of situation and the steps you should take. And of course, it is hugely important. One of the reasons I set up this podcast was so that I would be hearing good climate news stories at least once a week, so that I wouldn't be going into a kind of a fetal position on the floor with tears streaming down my face kind of thing. So kind of it is interesting. I understand what you mean as well, just doing small steps yourself. Sure, it can feel like it doesn't make a difference in the grand scheme of things, but it does to me, or it does to you, if you do make those changes or take some steps. Yeah, I can see your point. It makes a lot of sense.
And it also provides opportunities for people to gather together in small communities. Having lived in small villages and in larger cities, I really appreciate the notion of human scale functions. And some of the functions that were traditionally provided by human societies have been shunted off as we've moved towards increasing independence in the modern world. And Yuval Harari talks about this in the book Sapiens, where we basically made a trade-off at some point for us to be able to leave the little village where our family had already lived and no longer be seen as the butcher's son or whatever, and to be able to go and find the world that really makes us, or find the life that really makes us feel fulfilled. We had to give up some things. And those things that we've given up, the traditional functions of community, are largely filled in by either the state or the market right now. So we seek these nourishing aspects, whether it's healthcare, whether it is community relations, whether it's a sense of personal identity. We express our personal identity by what we buy, what we wear, that sort of thing. So the market has subsumed that. But in fact, when we find ourselves in times of crisis, and this became very obvious during the pandemic with the emergence of mutual aid groups around cities, making sure that folks who were not able to leave their homes were getting food, were getting medicine, that sort of thing. It was so inspiring to me, finding these opportunities in the time of crisis to gather together with friends, 3 friends, 5 friends, 10 friends. And for example, to share our fears and anxieties, to bring them out in the open where they no longer can just fester within us, and to find out, oh, I'm not the only person who feels this way. There is a therapeutic function in that. And then to move on where people can share examples that they know of other folks who are doing inspiring work, whether that's getting arrested at a pipeline or whether that's going to COP26 or whatever it may be. And then recognizing, okay, what can we do together, and putting it out there in a way that we are held accountable to it in a different way. And it may be something as simple as, I'm going to try not to drive my car on Tuesdays and Thursdays because I don't need to, or I'm going to write a letter to this representative, or whatever that may be. When we come out of that together, we are re-embedded in the oldest form of human community that strengthens us. We're no longer alone, and not being alone, we're no longer disempowered in the same way. It doesn't have to be that many people. I've actually heard of folks going through something kind of similar with grief cafes or death cafes or something like that, where people get together to share the experiences that they've had over losing a loved one. And they come out of that feeling supported, feeling stronger. So that's something that can happen really in any community if you're willing to be vulnerable enough to reach out to folks and say, listen, I'm feeling really overwhelmed by this, and I think it would be great if you would join me and a few friends, and we'll go have a cup of tea together and reflect on this. That's the way that it feels most comfortable.
Right.
The way that I see it as somebody who's studied the sociology of religion and that sort of thing is these are rituals that we do to ground us and to empower us.
So it's kind of group therapy for climate activists, climate anonymous, if we want to call it that.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. And there are multiple opportunities for things like that. It can even happen in the first 10 minutes of a meeting for another purpose. Let's just take a few minutes and share what we're most concerned about. Now let's think of somebody who inspires us, that sort of thing.
Okay. And of course, if you're doing it locally, the solutions you come up with locally will be for local issues. And that's empowering as well, because if you are solving local issues, you actually see progress.
Exactly. Sometimes I'll have students who live in very large urban areas, and they tend to feel much more disempowered than folks living in smaller towns. And in those cases, I'll frequently suggest that they try to identify something at the neighborhood level, because that ability to take action and have an effect is so empowering and can scale up from there. And maybe it's not individually anymore. Maybe you have several neighborhood communities working together to create a change. And, that's when I think about the skills and knowledge that people coming through my graduate program pick up along the way, one of the things is knowledge about how policy works in their own community. Obviously, there's international climate policy, which is a whole other issue. But let's say, for example, that you wanted to take out your lawn and turn your front yard into a garden. What are the zoning ordinances in place? What are the regulations in place that might prevent you from doing that? And because my students are all over the world in these online classes, they're sharing with each other what they're finding out about those policies. They're seeing first that, hey, the way things are done in my community is not the only way they can be done. Second, they're seeing examples from other students that may be inspiring. And third, they're also learning what are the processes by which existing regulations can be changed. What channels would I have to go through? So it's a step-by-step empowerment to making change at the local level. At the national and international level, because we have to rely on really inefficient political systems, it may be that some people decide the best thing that they could do is to try to restructure or revision the political system so that, for example, personal contributions aren't skewing the system towards people being elected to those positions who may not have the best interest of constituents at heart. So campaign finance reform may not seem like an obvious task for climate activists, but it very much is. And I tell students, trust that you are going to feel called individually to a particular kind of action. And don't worry too much about whether that focus distracts you from other things that you could be doing. Trust that other people are going to be called in those directions. Pay attention to what each other's doing, support one another in those actions, be a good ally, but listen to what feels most urgent to you and find a way to make a change in that area.
Cool, Laird. This has been fascinating. Most of the episodes I've done on the podcast, we've been, talking about technical solutions, whereas we're really talking more around the lines of mental health, if you want, and moving people's mindset rather than any big technical changes. So it's been a fascinating conversation. As I say, we're coming towards the end of the podcast. So is there any question I didn't ask that you wish I did, or any aspect of this we haven't covered off that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
I think I would return for just a moment to the resettlement of people displaced by climate change, which, as you mentioned, we're probably looking at hundreds of millions of people by 2050. And when we imagine what that might look like to open our own communities to people who've been displaced by the impacts of our daily life, what would have to change for that to become a welcoming community? And we've talked about this a little bit just in terms of the communications in a polarized setting. But I guess that I would say there are other ways to become more functional communities that opens the door potentially for making decisions like that some people would find very threatening. And a part of that is simply to function as a community with people that you may disagree with politically. I had an experience in small town Vermont where I lived for a while, where I was playing bluegrass music weekly at a little jam. And the people who would come to that jam came from all different walks of life, carpenters, mechanics, artisans, teachers, that sort of thing. We played music together. And often we didn't even know how much we might disagree about some of the fundamental political issues of our time. But we functioned together. And there's something about playing music where you're harmonizing or you're filling in spaces that is very much an example of people working together as a community. And I became good friends with people who I would probably not have spoken with if we had started from a place of politics. And so I would say at the most basic community level, finding opportunities to engage in a friendly fashion with other people who are a part of your community so that it makes it harder for them to see you as the villain, and it makes it harder for you to see them as the villain. And instead you see yourself as two people working from different experiences, engaging with different media that leads you to come to different solutions. But it's a very different situation to say, this person has made a different decision than I have, than it is to say, this person is evil. So potlucks are a wonderful way, neighborhood potlucks that might bring people together. There are skills that we can learn that allow us to set guidelines in place that help us avoid some of the contentious issues that might arise. And for some people, it's all about being contentious. It's like, there's that person, look at the hat he's wearing. I can tell his politics. I'm going to get in his face. So that doesn't do anyone any good at all. Take off the hat, sit down next to somebody, find out what they do for a living, find out, something about their family. Katharine Hayhoe, the climate scientist who wrote the book Saving Us a couple of years ago, because she comes from a fundamentalist Christian background, her book is really useful, in providing models of ways for talking with people who are skeptical or antagonistic to the science of climate change. I would recommend that book highly, and we use it in a couple of our classes. We need to start by being good neighbors, being good family, having conversations that allow us to build real relationships. And then on top of that, we can begin doing the work of long-term cultural evolution.
Sure. Fascinating. Laird, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Well, I guess probably the page for my graduate program, the Master of Science in Resilient and Sustainable Communities at Prescott College. They can contact me through that. My email is there, and I welcome the chance to talk to people individually. I've got a LinkedIn profile as well if folks just want to know more and see other podcasts or videos or that sort of thing that I do. But yeah, please send them to that link. I'd love to hear from folks.
Great. I'll put those two links, your LinkedIn and that page, in the show notes of this episode so people can find them there. Fantastic. Laird, that's been really interesting. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Tom. It's been fun.